Did Wyatt Earp really do that? Myths versus facts. What really happened in the gunfight that made him a legend? And how did a man with such a complicated past become one of America's greatest heroes? Wyatt Earp, the name alone brings to mind dusty streets, blazing guns, and fearless justice. But was he truly the man Hollywood made him out to be, or something far more complex? In this video, we'll peel back the legend, step into the real history, and uncover the man behind the myth. By the end, you may see Wyatt Earp in a way you never imagined. Wyatt Earp's shaky start. Lawman or liar? When you think of Wyatt Earp, what image comes to mind? Probably a tall, fearless man in a dusty frontier town, ready to draw his gun in the name of justice. That's the picture Hollywood painted. But the truth is far less tidy. Before he became known as a lawman, Wyatt was often on the other side of the law. His early life is a story of running, fighting, and reinventing himself again and again. So let's step back and see how the most famous badge-wearer in the West began his life as a fugitive, gambler, and opportunist. Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp was born in Monmouth, Illinois, in 1848. He was the son of Nicholas Earp, a restless man who moved his family often. By the time Wyatt was a teenager, he had lived in Illinois, Iowa, and California. His family wasn't poor, but they weren't well off either. They were wanderers, always chasing better land or brighter opportunities. Wyatt grew up tough, restless, and eager for more than farm chores. When the Civil War broke out, Wyatt wanted to fight. He tried to enlist in the Union Army, even lying about his age. He was turned away, still too young. Instead, he hauled freight, worked odd jobs, and learned to live rough. But he wasn't headed toward a heroic path. His first real mark on history was a criminal one. In 1871, at the age of 23, Wyatt was arrested in Arkansas for horse theft. That was no small matter. Stealing horses was one of the most serious crimes on the frontier, often punished by hanging. He was locked in jail, but he didn't stay long. Wyatt escaped before trial and fled. For the next year, he was a wanted man. The famous lawman of later years began his adult life as a fugitive from justice. After his escape, Wyatt didn't settle down to respectability. He drifted back to Illinois, to the city of Peoria. There, he found himself in more trouble. Court records and newspapers show that Wyatt was arrested 3 times in brothels, not as a casual visitor, but as someone working inside. Most historians believe he was acting as a bouncer or perhaps even a procurer. The local paper listed him under vagrants and lewd persons, not exactly the reputation of a future icon. The pattern was clear. When life got hot, Wyatt ran. He moved again, this time heading for Kansas, where the frontier towns were booming. In 1874, he turned up in Wichita, a cattle town overflowing with saloons, gamblers, and gunmen. Despite his criminal past, Wyatt managed to join the local police force. That might sound odd, but it wasn't unusual. Frontier towns needed muscle more than spotless records. If a man was strong, tough, and could swing a club or fire a pistol, he was worth hiring. For a time, Wyatt did his job well. He patrolled the streets, broke up fights, and kept drunken cowboys from tearing the town apart. He earned praise for arresting tough men without always using his gun. But his temper was never far from the surface. In 1876, he got into a fight with a political rival during an election for city marshal. He assaulted the man, was fined, and promptly lost his position on the force. Just like that, his career in Wichita was over. But Wyatt was nothing if not resourceful. He packed up and went to Dodge City, another wild cattle town. Dodge was even rougher than Wichita, filled with cowboys flush with trail money and gamblers ready to take it. There, Wyatt became assistant marshal under Charlie Bassett, and later under the famous Bat Masterson. He built a reputation as a man who wouldn't back down. People said he was cool under pressure, steady with a pistol, and willing to face down dangerous men. Still, his personal life didn't match his badge. Wyatt lived with a woman named Celia and Mattie Blaylock, often called his common-law wife. She had worked as a prostitute. They were never legally married. Their relationship was practical rather than romantic, and it showed the other side of Wyatt's world. He was always connected to gambling halls, saloons, and the shadowy trade around them. By the late 1870s, Wyatt was better known. Some papers praised him for his calmness in crises, while others criticized him as a gambler in lawman's clothing. Both descriptions were accurate. Wyatt wasn't dedicated to law and order in the sense of modern police work. He was dedicated to keeping the peace in towns where peace meant steady business. If the gamblers and saloon owners were happy, Wyatt was happy. And if that meant bending rules, so be it. Around 1879, Wyatt and his brothers headed west again, this time to Arizona territory. The town of Tombstone was booming thanks to silver mines. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made overnight and violence followed close behind. Wyatt claimed he was interested in stagecoach businesses, but soon he and his brothers were knee-deep in gambling and saloon ventures. This was the same Wyatt who had been arrested for horse theft just years earlier, now acting as a deputy in a growing mining town. But here's a detail many people miss. Wyatt was never the town marshal of Tombstone. That position belonged to his brother Virgil. Wyatt only served as a deputy marshal on occasion. Still, the Hollywood versions almost always make him the central lawman, leaving Virgil in the shadows. The myth had already begun while Wyatt was still alive. So what do we see in these early years? Not a flawless lawman, not even a consistent one. Instead, we see a man who lived by quick thinking, fast moves, and a willingness to start over when trouble caught up. He was a horse thief who became a deputy, a brothel bouncer who wore a badge, a gambler who preached law and order, a man who could be both outlaw and officer, depending on the day and the town. The truth is, Wyatt Earp's rise wasn't about honesty or integrity. It was about survival. The frontier was full of men like him, drifters, fighters, gamblers, most of whom vanished into history. Wyatt stood out because he played both sides and lived long enough to tell his story. While others died young, Wyatt grew old, polishing his legend as he went. That legend begins to take shape here, in his shaky start. A man who should have been remembered as a fugitive and gambler instead positioned himself as a peacekeeper. He was never spotless, never perfect, but always able to reinvent himself. And that ability, more than any fast draw or quick shot, is what made Wyatt Earp famous. In our next chapter, we'll head to the most famous 30 seconds in Western history, the gunfight at the OK Corral. You may think you know what happened, but the truth is stranger than the legend. What really happened at the OK Corral? Say the words OK Corral, and most people picture a dramatic showdown in the middle of town. Guns blazing, lawmen standing tall, outlaws falling in slow motion. Hollywood has made it look like a 10-minute gun battle, a perfect fight of good versus evil. But what if the truth was just 30 seconds of confusion, anger, and dust? What if the so-called heroes weren't entirely lawful, and the so-called villains weren't all criminals? Let's set the record straight. By 1881, Tombstone, Arizona was a silver boomtown. People flooded in from all over America chasing fast money. Along with them came gamblers, drifters, and gunmen. It was a place of wealth and chaos. Law existed, but it was thin. On one side stood the business class, the merchants, bankers, and saloon owners who wanted order. On the other stood the cowboys, a gang of cattle rustlers and toughs who believed they ruled the countryside. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, were caught in the middle. They were lawmen, but also gamblers and businessmen. They carried badges, but they also carried personal grudges. And then there was Doc Holliday, Wyatt's friend, a deadly gambler with a reputation for trouble. Their rivals were the Clantons and McClorys, leaders of the cowboy faction. These men lived by different rules. They rustled cattle across the border, threatened townsfolk, and often bragged that no badge could stop them. The stage was set for a clash that would echo for more than a century. On October 25, 1881, Ike Clanton came to town already drunk and spoiling for a fight. Witnesses heard him say he wanted to kill the Earps. He carried his Winchester rifle and his revolver, showing them off as he made threats. Later that night, he met Wyatt in a saloon. Wyatt didn't back down. Words were exchanged, promises of violence made. The fuse was lit. The next morning, Ike was still in town, still armed, and still angry. Virgil Earp, who was acting town marshal, arrested him for carrying a gun inside city limits. Wyatt pistol-whipped him in public, sending him staggering through the streets with a bloody head. Ike paid a fine, but he didn't leave. His humiliation only deepened his fury. That same afternoon, Ike's brother Billy and the McClory brothers, Tom and Frank, arrived in Tombstone. They carried guns, which again violated the city's ordinance. Sheriff Johnny Bean, who had little love for the Earps, tried to calm the situation. He spoke with the cowboys, urging them to disarm. They refused. Instead, they gathered near a vacant lot beside a photo studio, close to, but not inside, the OK Corral. Here's the twist that many don't know. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral didn't actually happen in the corral. It took place in that vacant lot, a cramped space only about 15 feet wide. But Gunfight in the vacant lot next to Fly's photo studio doesn't sound like a blockbuster title, does it? By 3 o'clock, Virgil Earp had deputized Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc Holliday. The four men armed themselves and walked toward the lot. Virgil carried a cane in one hand and a revolver in the other. Wyatt had a six-shooter. Morgan had a pistol. Holliday hid a shotgun under his coat. Witnesses said Wyatt looked determined, while Doc looked almost eager. When they reached the lot, about 6 feet separated the two groups. Virgil shouted, "Throw up your hands. I want your guns." What happened next remains one of history's greatest debates. Some said Billy Clanton and Frank McClory went for their guns first. Others swore they were already raising their hands when the Earps fired. Tom McClory may not have been armed at all. The truth disappeared in the smoke of black powder. The shooting lasted no more than 30 seconds. When it ended, 3 cowboys were dead. Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, and Frank McClory. Ike Clanton had fled at the first shot, running down the street. On the other side, Virgil and Morgan were wounded, Doc Holliday was grazed, and Wyatt Earp stood untouched. The aftermath split Tombstone in two. Supporters of the Earps claimed it was a lawful act, necessary to protect the town. Supporters of the Cowboys called it cold-blooded murder. Newspapers printed both views, turning the event into instant legend. The law had to respond. A coroner's inquest listed the dead men and their wounds. Billy Clanton was shot in the chest and arm, still clutching his revolver. Frank McClory was hit in the belly and head. Tom McClory was blasted with Doc Holliday's shotgun. Judge Wells Spicer held a month-long hearing. Dozens of witnesses testified. Some said the Cowboys had drawn first. Others insisted at least one was unarmed and surrendering. In the end, Spicer ruled in favor of the Earps. He said they had acted within their duty as lawmen, though he also noted they might have used unnecessary force. It was a legal victory, but not a moral one. The town remained divided, and blood feuds only deepened. So what really happened? Was it a noble fight for justice, or a family ambush carried out under the color of law? The truth sits somewhere in between. The Cowboys were violent men, but the Earps weren't saints. They were businessmen protecting their power as much as protecting the law. The fight wasn't good versus evil. It was a street fight between rivals, one faction wearing badges, the other wearing cowboy hats. Hollywood didn't like that version. Over the decades, movies turned 30 seconds of chaos into 10 minutes of scripted bravery. Wyatt was painted as the noble lawman, Doc Holliday as the charming sidekick, and the Cowboys as faceless villains. The real complexities were buried beneath the myth. Even the location was twisted. The OK Corral was simply easier to market than a narrow alley. And so, history became legend. Tourists now stand in Tombstone, watching actors reenact the fight. They see clear heroes and villains, not the messy truth of gun smoke and confusion. Wyatt himself helped shape the legend. In later years, he told his version of the fight again and again, always placing himself as the calm hero who stood firm against lawless men. He never admitted uncertainty. He never admitted that maybe not everyone had been armed. By the time Hollywood came calling, his version had become gospel. So what should we remember? Not the movie version, not the tourist show, but the reality. A fight lasting half a minute, leaving 3 men dead, and a town forever divided. It was not the triumph of law over chaos, but a symbol of how thin the line between the two could be in the Wild West. The OK Corral wasn't the end of Wyatt's story. It was only the beginning of his most violent chapter, because in the months to come, his brothers would be shot down, and Wyatt would launch his own war, a vendetta ride across Arizona that would blur the line between justice and revenge. The vendetta ride, law's last stand, or personal vengeance. The gunfight at the OK Corral didn't end the violence in Tombstone. It only lit the fuse. The Cowboys wanted payback, and the Earps braced for war. What followed was not law enforcement. It was personal vengeance. History calls it the vendetta ride. a bloody campaign across Arizona that turned Wyatt Earp into both a hero and a hunted man. The spark came in December 1881, just 2 months after the famous gunfight. Virgil Earp, acting town marshal, walked through Tombstone at night. Suddenly, shotgun blasts rang out from a dark alley. Buckshot tore through his arm and shoulder. Virgil collapsed in the street, bleeding heavily. He survived, but his arm was ruined for life. The attackers melted into the night. Everyone knew they were cowboys, but no one was arrested. The message was clear. The feud wasn't over, and the law wasn't enough to protect the Earps. Then came the real blow. On the night of March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was playing billiards with friends in Campbell and Hatch's saloon. Shots crashed through the window. A bullet hit Morgan in the back, piercing his spine. He died within the hour. He was only 30 years old. Wyatt stood over his brother's body and swore revenge. The courts had failed, the sheriff was useless, and the cowboys were still free. From that moment, Wyatt was no longer acting as a deputy or a peace officer. He was acting as a brother out for blood. The first target was Frank Stillwell, a known cowboy and suspect in Morgan's killing. 2 days after the funeral, the Earps escorted Morgan's body to the train station. They planned to ship him back to Colton, California, for burial. At the station, Wyatt spotted Stillwell lurking near the tracks. Witnesses later said Stillwell ran when he saw Wyatt's group approach. Wyatt and his posse caught him in the rail yard. Shots rang out in the darkness. When dawn came, Stillwell's body lay riddled with bullets. His shotgun lay beside him, never fired. Wyatt admitted to killing him. There was no trial, no jury, just revenge served cold. After Stillwell's death, Sheriff Johnny Bean issued warrants for Wyatt and his men, but Wyatt had already left Tombstone, riding hard with a posse of allies. His group included Doc Holliday, Sherman McMaster, Texas Jack, Vermillion, and Warren Earp, the youngest brother. Together they became known as the Earp Vendetta Posse. Their mission was simple: hunt down every cowboy they believed had a hand in the attacks. The next showdown came at Iron Springs, near the Whetstone Mountains. Wyatt's posse rode straight into a group of cowboys led by Curly Bill Brocious, one of the most feared gunmen in the territory. The cowboys opened fire with shotguns. Wyatt's horse went down, but he kept moving, Winchester rifle in hand. He shot Curly Bill in the stomach at close range, killing him instantly. The other cowboys scattered. Wyatt's men swore he never flinched, never hesitated, even as lead whistled past him. In their telling, it was the bravest act they had ever seen. With Curly Bill dead, the vendetta ride only grew more dangerous. The posse killed several more suspected cowboys, including Indian Charlie Cruz, accused of being one of Morgan's assassins. Some of the killings were in gunfights. Others were ambushes. The line between justice and murder blurred completely. Sheriff Bean pursued Wyatt across the countryside with a posse of his own, but he never caught him. Wyatt always rode ahead, using the rugged desert terrain to his advantage. Supporters gave him food, shelter, and fresh horses. To his allies, he was avenging a murdered brother. To his enemies, he was a killer on the run. The newspapers followed the story closely. Some praised Wyatt as a fearless lawman cleaning up the territory. Others condemned him as a vigilante taking the law into his own hands. The truth was both. Wyatt was no longer acting under any legal authority. His badge meant nothing once he left Tombstone. He was fighting a personal war. By April 1882, the vendetta had run its course. The cowboys were scattered, dead, or hiding. Wyatt had made his point, but he had also made too many enemies. With warrants hanging over his head, he fled Arizona for New Mexico, then Colorado. He would never return to Tombstone. The vendetta ride became one of the most controversial episodes in Wyatt's life. Supporters called it justice in a land where the law had failed. Critics called it cold-blooded revenge. Both sides had evidence. Wyatt had killed men without trial, but those men were known outlaws. The question was whether that excused him or condemned him. Wyatt himself never expressed regret. Years later, when asked about the killings, he said only that his enemies got what they deserved. He never mentioned the legal gray area, never admitted to crossing the line. In his mind, his actions were justified. His brother had been murdered, the law had done nothing, and someone had to answer for it. What made the vendetta ride so memorable wasn't just the violence. It was the way it captured the contradictions of the West. law and outlaw blurred. A man could wear a badge one day and commit murder the next. Justice was often personal, carried out with a six-shooter instead of a judge's gavel. Wyatt embodied that contradiction more than anyone else. The legend of the vendetta ride grew over time. Some claimed Wyatt had faced 50 men at once, mowing them down like a figure from myth. Others said he killed twice as many cowboys as records suggest. Hollywood would later turn it into a tale of righteous vengeance, a clean fight between good and evil. The truth was far darker. It was a story of grief, anger, and survival in a place where law often meant nothing. When the smoke cleared, Wyatt Earp was no longer a tombstone lawman. He was in exile, carrying the memory of his brother's death and the blood of his enemies on his hands. He would spend the rest of his life drifting from town to town, always moving, always retelling his past. The vendetta ride followed him everywhere, both a badge of honor and a shadow on his name. It was the turning point of his life. Before it, he could claim to be a lawman. After it, he was something else, a man who had taken justice into his own hands and never looked back. And so, the question remains, was the vendetta ride Wyatt Earp's finest hour or his darkest moment? That depends on whether you see him as a brother avenging blood or as a killer who stepped outside the law. Either way, it made him unforgettable. Next, we'll follow Wyatt into the later years, when his killings raised questions the courts never answered. How did he manage to escape justice every time? Killings, courts, and cover-ups. How did Wyatt get away with it? Wyatt Earp's life was filled with gunfire, yet somehow, he never spent a day in prison for killing a man. How did he manage it? Was he truly acting within the law, or did his reputation and connections protect him? The answer lies in a string of killings, hearings, and clever cover-ups that let Wyatt walk free when others would have swung from a rope. In the Wild West, justice was often murky. Courts were young, juries were biased, and lawmen were often little better than outlaws. Wyatt Earp thrived in that world because he understood how to work it. He killed when he had to, or when he wanted to, and always found a way to justify it. His first known killing came during his time in Dodge City. He was serving as assistant marshal under Charlie Bassett and later Bat Masterson. Wyatt confronted a drunken cowboy who refused to hand over his pistol. Accounts differ, but Wyatt ended the standoff with a bullet. No trial followed. The cowboy had a reputation as a troublemaker, and townsfolk backed Wyatt. To them, he had rid the city of a nuisance. To the law, it was simply officer in the line of duty. That set the pattern. When Wyatt killed, he picked enemies who were already unpopular. It made his actions easier to defend and harder to prosecute. The most famous killings, of course, came at the OK Corral. In October 1881, Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday shot down Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers, 3 men dead in less than a minute. Wyatt walked away untouched, but Tombstone didn't just shrug. A month-long hearing followed under Judge Wells Spicer. More than 30 witnesses testified, some saying the cowboys had their hands up, others swearing they drew first. The evidence was muddy, but Wyatt's reputation as a fearless lawman carried weight. In the end, Spicer ruled the Earps had acted lawfully, yet he couldn't resist adding that their actions bordered on rashness. In other words, legal, but barely. The cowboys weren't satisfied. They struck back by ambushing Virgil and assassinating Morgan. Wyatt's answer was the vendetta ride. During that campaign, he admitted to killing Frank Stillwell at the Tucson train yard. No judge, no jury, just gunfire. Sheriff Johnny Bean tried to arrest him, but Wyatt slipped away. By then, Wyatt wasn't even pretending to act under official orders. He was on a personal mission. Still, no charges ever stuck. Then came Iron Springs, where Wyatt shot Curly Bill Brocious. That killing became part of his legend. Wyatt claimed he stood alone against a hail of shotgun fire, killing Curly Bill with a single shot. Whether the story was embellished or not, the outcome was clear. Curly Bill was dead, and Wyatt walked free once again. The authorities didn't press the issue. Curly Bill had been one of the most feared outlaws in the territory. Few shed tears. So why no legal consequences? One reason was the West itself. Courts were weak, and witnesses were unreliable. Inquests often relied on the testimony of friends or allies. If you had enough supporters, the verdict could swing your way. Wyatt always had friends in the right places. In Dodge City, Bat Masterson shielded him. In Arizona, businessmen favored him over the cowboys. In Colorado, he mingled with sheriffs who looked the other way. His network was as valuable as his revolver. Another reason was reputation. Wyatt cultivated the image of a man who stayed cool under fire. Witnesses said he didn't flinch when bullets flew. That aura of calm gave him credibility in hearings. If he claimed he fired in self-defense, people believed him. After all, Wyatt wasn't seen as reckless. He was seen as deliberate. But not all of his killings fit the heroic mold. In 1896, Wyatt refereed a heavyweight boxing match in San Francisco between Bob Fitzsimmons and Tom Sharkey. Fitzsimmons dominated the fight, but Wyatt called a foul and awarded the victory to Sharkey. The crowd erupted in outrage, accusing Wyatt of fixing the match. Though not a killing, it showed another side of him, a man willing to bend rules when money or friends were involved. His credibility took a hit, but not enough to ruin him. By the time Wyatt reached old age, his violent past was fading into legend. He lived quietly in California, far from the towns where he had spilled blood. Reporters came to him for stories, and Wyatt gave them polished versions of his past. He left out the messy details. He never mentioned horse theft, brothels, or questionable shootings. Instead, he presented himself as a man who only killed when the law demanded it. He carefully controlled his narrative, and because so few records survived, people believed him. The truth is, Wyatt survived because he was practical. He knew when to shoot, when to run, and when to talk. He avoided trials whenever possible, and when dragged into court, he leaned on allies, reputation, and the public's dislike of his enemies. He never relied solely on the badge. He relied on strategy. Think about the men he killed. Frank Stillwell, a suspected assassin. Curly Bill, a notorious outlaw. Billy Clanton and the McClorys, rustlers with bad reputations. None of them were beloved. That mattered. Killing a respected citizen might have doomed him. Killing outlaws made him look like a hero. Wyatt also outlived his critics. Many of the men who hated him died young. By the 1920s, few remained to challenge his stories. He could shape the past however he liked, and no one could correct him. By the time Hollywood came calling, Wyatt was the only source left. He handed them the legend he had been crafting for decades. So how did Wyatt Earp get away with it? By picking his targets carefully, by having the right friends, by building a reputation that juries and judges respected, and by outliving anyone who might have told a different tale. He wasn't invincible, but he was clever enough to survive. In the end, his record speaks for itself. He was accused, investigated, and hunted, but never convicted. He fired his gun in anger, revenge, and self-defense, but the law never held him accountable. To some, that makes him a hero who stood above corrupt courts. To others, it makes him a manipulator who used reputation as a shield. Either way, the blood on his hands never led to iron bars. As we move to the final chapter, we'll see how those killings, hearings, and cover-ups laid the foundation for something greater. Wyatt Earp would not remain a controversial gunman. He would be transformed into an American legend, polished by dime novels and Hollywood scripts until the rough edges disappeared. The man became myth, and the myth became larger than life. From has-been to hero, the making of a legend. When Wyatt Earp died in 1929, his passing barely made the papers. He was 80 years old, living quietly in Los Angeles, far from the dust and gun smoke of his youth. No parades, no national mourning, just a small funeral attended by family, a few friends, and his wife, Josephine. At the time, he was not remembered as a great hero, but as an old gambler who had once lived a rough life in the frontier towns. Yet within a few years, his name would be known around the world. How did Wyatt Earp go from forgotten has-been to American legend? The answer begins long before his death. In his later years, Wyatt realized that stories mattered more than facts. He spent decades telling his own version of events, cutting out the shameful episodes and polishing the exciting ones. He wanted to be remembered as the bravest lawman of the frontier, not as a horse thief, brothel bouncer, or wandering gambler. To make that happen, he carefully managed his reputation. Wyatt and his wife Josephine moved often in their later years. They lived in San Diego, San Francisco, and eventually Los Angeles. Wyatt never held a steady job. Instead, he made money from gambling, mining schemes, and investments in racetracks. But he always made time to talk with journalists, novelists, and anyone willing to listen. When asked about his past, he gave the same answers: brave stands, quick draws, and justice served. He left out the vendetta killings, the scandals, and the times. He was fired from law jobs. The omissions were deliberate. By the 1920s, Wyatt was spending time in Hollywood. The movie industry was booming, and westerns were already popular. Wyatt struck up friendships with actors and directors, including William S. Hart and a young John Ford. He visited film sets, gave advice on how real lawmen carried themselves, and hinted that his life would make a great story. The timing was perfect. The West was closing, its wild days gone. Americans wanted heroes from that fading era, and Wyatt was ready to supply one. Wyatt's biggest break came in 1931, 2 years after his death. Stuart Lake, a writer who had interviewed Wyatt extensively in his final years, published a book titled Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. The book was a sensation. It painted Wyatt as a fearless lawman who brought peace to lawless towns, standing tall against rustlers and killers. Lake admitted later that much of it was dramatized, but at the time, no one cared. The country was in the middle of the Great Depression, desperate for stories of courage and honor. Wyatt Earp fit the bill perfectly. Hollywood quickly picked up on Lake's book. Movies in the 1930s and 1940s began to feature Wyatt as a central figure. In 1946, My Darling Clementine, starring Henry Fonda, showed Wyatt as a noble marshal bringing order to Tombstone. The movie ignored his gambling, his questionable past, and even his brother Virgil's role. Instead, Wyatt stood as the one true hero. The legend was locked in place. From there, the myth only grew. Each new film or novel added layers of glory. Gunfight at the OK Corral in 1957 made the famous shootout into a clean showdown between noble lawmen and evil cowboys. Later, Tombstone and Wyatt Earp in the 1990s gave modern audiences the same story, dressed up with Hollywood stars. Always the same image: Wyatt, calm and brave, squaring off against chaos and winning. The irony is that by the time the legend peaked, the truth was nearly forgotten. The real Wyatt had been a drifter, a gambler, a man who crossed the line between lawman and outlaw more than once. He had been arrested, fired, and accused of murder, but the public didn't want the messy man. They wanted the clean myth, and thanks to Stuart Lake, Hollywood, and Wyatt's own efforts, that's what they got. The town of Tombstone embraced the legend as well. What had once been a rough mining camp became a tourist attraction. Visitors could walk the streets, tour saloons, and watch staged reenactments of the OK Corral gunfight. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story, and Wyatt's name sold tickets. Statues went up, plaques were placed, and soon Wyatt was the face of the Old West. Why did the myth take hold so strongly? Because Wyatt's story fit what Americans wanted to believe about themselves: a lone man, standing for order in a lawless world, a figure who could not be bribed, bought, or broken. He represented toughness, independence, and justice without hesitation. In reality, Wyatt was complicated and often self-serving. But myths don't survive on complications. They survive on symbols. Wyatt became that symbol. His transformation also shows the power of timing. If Wyatt had died young, killed in Tombstone or during his vendetta ride, he might have been remembered as just another violent gunman. Instead, he lived long enough to rewrite his life. He lived long enough for the world to forget the details and remember only the parts he wanted remembered. And he died just as Hollywood was searching for legends to bring to the screen. History and timing gave him immortality. By the time scholars began digging into the records, comparing Wyatt's claims with court documents and eyewitness accounts, the legend was already too big. The facts showed contradictions, stories Wyatt told that didn't match the evidence, killings that were murkier than his clean version. But the public didn't care. The man was less important than the myth he left behind. Today, Wyatt Earp is still one of the most famous names of the Old West. Schoolchildren learn his story, tourists flock to Tombstone, and movies continue to bring him back to life. Few pause to ask how much of it was true. That's the power of myth. It outlives reality. So how did Wyatt Earp go from has-been to hero? By telling his story the way he wanted it told, by finding the right writers and the right time, by letting Hollywood do the rest. He may not have been the noble lawman people believe, but he understood something vital. Legends are more powerful than facts, and once a legend takes hold, it never dies. In the end, Wyatt Earp succeeded in his greatest gamble. He bet that history would remember him not as he was, but as he wanted to be, and he won. The man became myth, and the myth became immortal.